The first rock flew at her while she was still digging the trench. It thunked against the iron kettle she'd strapped to her back for protection, spun off the curve of it, and landed in the dirt beside her bare heel. She didn't flinch. She just went on digging, shoulders hunched low like a work mule, palms blistered raw, apron muddy from the knee down. The second rock was larger, and it struck her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. The third missed her head by inches. Still, she didn't look back. If she had, she'd have seen them all standing there. 3 men, a half-drunk boy, and even one woman holding her toddler on her hip while she smiled at the show. They weren't exactly throwing to kill, just to scare, to shame, to punish. But the edge in their voices said they wouldn't mind if a little hurt landed along the way. "Hey, Ma'am Tower," shouted one man, cupping his hands like a bell. "Why don't you build a drawbridge next? Maybe some battlements up top, huh?" His friends howled. Another added, "Heard you was gonna rig up boiling oil from the top when we all come to mock you. Just needs a knight to come rescue her," said the woman, grinning. "Too bad she buried the last one." Laughter again, cruel, unthinking, the kind that had festered all spring and now boiled out with the summer heat. But the widow, she said nothing. She just kept on shoveling, her one good boot slipping on a flat stone as she wrenched it from the mud. She had long since lost the other boot. She'd dug with one bare foot for 2 months now. The last of her family's money had gone into the cart that had carried the stones here. And still, not one beam of pine, not one log, no cabin, just a pile of rock where she worked alone, digging foundations deep into soil that had seen the bones of better men. Her name was Clara Bell Worth, and 2 seasons back her husband froze to death on the floor of a half-rotted cabin, curled around their youngest son, trying to keep the boy alive with the last of his own heat. The boy didn't make it either. Now she was here, building a tower, and every settler around, every man who'd offered to help her build a proper home with a roof so thin you could hear the wolves breathe outside, they all agreed she'd gone mad, crazy from grief, stone-lugging lunacy, that's what they called it. And maybe she had, maybe she was a little mad, but not in the way they thought. Because Clara Bell Worth knew something they didn't. She knew what it felt like to kneel over a frozen child's face and still feel the walls leaking cold around you. She knew the draft that slips through the gaps in every log cabin, no matter how much moss you stuff. She knew the sound a beam makes when it cracks under snow weight. And she knew one thing above all else. Wood would fail her. Stone would not. So she kept building. The tower was only 2 stories, and round like a silo. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't tall enough to boast. It looked like a grain bin had swallowed a well. But it stood, even unfinished. It stood with a kind of solemn defiance. The base was sunk 5 feet into the earth, not just for stability, but for warmth. The walls were thick, over 3 feet in places, packed with old lime mortar she'd bartered off a passing freighter in exchange for her last horse bridle. Every stone had been hauled by hand or cart, scavenged from riverbeds and the ruins of a mining town that had burned 5 winters ago. Inside, there were no windows on the lower level, just 2 slits for ventilation. The ceiling was low to trap heat, and the upper level, reachable by a winding, dry-stacked stairway built into the wall itself, had a clever chimney and a single small window facing east to catch the morning sun. The floor was stone, but she'd lined it with sheepskins and earth-packed rugs. She planned to sleep below ground level, in a bed dug half into the wall itself, a trick she'd read in some old scrap of a Swedish farming journal. There was no stove yet, no fire pit, but she had a plan for that too, and that was why they mocked her hardest. Because it wasn't just that she wasn't building like them, it was that she was building smarter. Late that August, when a dry wind rolled down from the hills and baked the last moisture out of the wheat fields, a settler named Roy Kinley came riding by Clara's land, with 2 neighbors in tow. They said they were checking up on her. She was dragging a sandstone boulder into position with a rope across her chest like a mule when she looked up and saw them on their horses. "Well, hell," said Roy, "if it ain't the lady of the rock pile." The man beside him snorted. Clara didn't smile. She wiped her brow, hitched her dress, and went on dragging. "You ever gonna stop building that thing?" Roy asked. "We get it. You like rocks." Clara didn't look at them. "What's it for?" the second man asked, frowning. "You expecting a siege?" Roy leaned on the horn of his saddle. "She's got all her secrets, don't she? Bet it's real cozy in there come frost." That made them all laugh. But one of the men, the younger one, name was Todd Myers, didn't laugh. He looked at the tower a little longer than the others. And later that week, when he was drinking alone in the saloon and the wind outside shifted colder than it should have for September, he thought about that thick stone wall and how even the mocking hadn't stopped her from building it by hand. That night, he stopped laughing too. When the first snow came, it hit like a thief in the dark. October 9th. Too early, everyone said. The skies turned fast. The wind changed faster, and what was supposed to be a dusting became a full-blown blizzard that lasted 2 days and cracked half the wagons left uncovered. Livestock froze upright in the field. A child died in her sleep when the hearth went cold. But in Clara's tower, the fire never went out. That's when folks started whispering. No one said it plain, but the jokes slowed. Men stopped riding by just to point and chuckle. Someone claimed they'd seen steam rising from her chimney while theirs had gone cold. Someone else said she was burning rocks to stay warm. Someone else said she had a stove built into the floor like the old Dutch families used to do. Nobody knew, but suddenly everybody wanted to. Because while their logs cracked and their roofs groaned under snow, her tower just stood, still and quiet and strange, like it had been built for a world colder than theirs. And Clara? She didn't say a word. The real turning point came in December, when the second storm hit and knocked out 3 cabins in one night. Trees fell, roofs caved, the Kinley family's baby went into a fever, and Roy himself was seen hammering extra boards into his roof while snow piled past his knees. That's when he rode out again, this time alone. He didn't mock, he didn't grin, he just sat there on his horse, hat in hand, looking up at the tower, while snow curled off the eaves like smoke. He didn't ask to come in, he just sat there a while. And then Clara opened the door, just a crack, just enough for the light to fall across his face, and in that light he saw something strange. She wasn't cold, she wasn't wrapped in furs or quilts or shawls, just a plain wool dress, sleeves rolled, firelight at her back. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "It warm in there." She studied him, then nodded once, and closed the door. After that storm, they didn't laugh anymore, not one soul. The snow didn't melt for weeks. It packed hard into the hollows and turned to solid ice against the north-facing slopes. Smoke from the cabins hung low and sluggish over the valley, as if even the chimneys were tired. Most families spent every daylight hour chopping, hauling, stacking. The rest of their time they spent inside, knees against their chests, trying to coax heat out of stoves that leaked more warmth than they held. But from Clara's tower, thin plumes of wood smoke curled straight and constant, slow, deliberate, like breath from the throat of something that had no intention of dying. And still no one saw her come to town. No one saw her in the church, or the mercantile, or even at the shallow stream where folks cracked ice to gather water. One settler, an old woman named Eliza Kern, claimed she saw Clara once at dawn, trudging along the bluff with a bucket in each hand, her dress hem thick with frost, but her face dry, her step steady. But no one else could confirm it. She might have been dreaming. And so the talk changed. Before they'd said she was crazy. Now they weren't sure. Now it was stranger than madness. Now it was unsettling. By mid-January, the worst hit. A dry snap, clear sky. The kind of cold that didn't come with wind or storm, but simply arrived, like a guest who'd been waiting for the right moment to ruin you. That night, the temperature dropped near 40 below. Dogs froze mid-step. Water jugs burst into ice inside root cellars. And 2 cabins, old ones, rushed up fast during the boom year, caught fire when their chimneys cracked from thermal stress. By dawn, the valley had lost 4 more people. One was the town's blacksmith. The other 3 were children. The graveyard was too frozen to dig. They had to keep the bodies in the schoolhouse for 2 days until the ground softened enough to take a shovel. And all through it, the tower stood like a watchman, silent above the trees. No smoke at night, only by day, which puzzled them. Then, slowly, it struck someone, maybe one of the older Mennonite settlers, that Clara must have been heating the stone walls by day, letting them radiate through the night. Passive mass heating, they called it. A trick from Europe. Ancient stuff. Nobody did that here. Nobody could. Not without stone, not without time, not without stubbornness that bordered on delusion. But Clara had done it, and it was working. In the deep of that January freeze, the widow Worth stopped being a joke. She became a riddle. The men who used to jeer at her now spoke in low tones, asking one another if maybe she'd planned it all along, if maybe that crazy tower had been more than just grief work. A few wondered aloud if she'd known the freeze would be worse this year, if maybe the mountain tribes she'd once traded with had warned her, or if maybe she'd dreamed it. No one said it directly, but the more the cold settled, the more they leaned toward that old frontier feeling, that line where superstition begins to rise not from ignorance, but from the sheer weight of what you can't explain. By February, the ground had disappeared, not beneath snow, under silence. The entire valley went quiet. Children spoke in whispers. Men stared at the sky. Even the animals seemed subdued. The cold didn't just sting now. It crept. It lingered in your teeth, behind your knees, beneath your ribs. You'd find yourself shivering, even beside a stove. You'd feel the draft and not know where it came from. The kind of cold that made you doubt your house, your hands, your mind. Then, one evening, a boy named Caleb Fisk went missing. 12 years old, left the barn to fetch firewood, never made it back. They found him the next morning, half a mile from his house, curled in the hollow of a dead tree, eyes open, hands frostbitten to the bone, still clutching 3 small sticks. No one could understand how he'd ended up so far, until someone pointed out that from the edge of his father's property, from the rise where the boy had last been seen, the only thing visible across the snow was Clara Worth's tower, a single shape in the white, like a lighthouse on a frozen sea. And that's when something broke in Roy Kinley. He showed up again at Clara's, not as a man visiting a widow, but as a father with a hollow look in his eyes. This time, he didn't come alone. There were 3 others with him: the Myers boy, Eliza Kern, and Pastor Thorne, a man whose own cabin had nearly collapsed under ice that week. Roy knocked once, and this time, when the door opened, he didn't hesitate. "I'm not here to laugh." Clara didn't speak. She stood there, backlit by the orange of a low fire, one hand resting on the stone lintel like she belonged to it. Roy cleared his throat. "I got a girl, 13. She ain't eaten hot in days. Chimney's near gone. Our hearth's cracking. Can't keep no warmth. I don't—" He looked down at his boots. "I don't need charity. We'd trade, wood, nails, help come spring, whatever you need." Behind him, the others waited. Eliza looked ready to cry. Clara didn't answer right away, but after a long moment, she stepped aside. "Just her," she said. Roy blinked. "What?" Clara pointed behind him. "The girl. Bring her. At dusk. Alone. She's just a—" "You asked," Clara said. "Now I've answered," and she shut the door. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Roy brought his daughter, a thin, pale thing named Mabel, wrapped in 2 coats and a blanket. He kissed her forehead at the edge of the clearing and walked back without a word. She stepped to the door alone. Clara let her in, and that night, for the first time, someone else saw the inside of the tower. The next morning, Mabel walked back down the hill with steam rising from her coat and a strange calm in her face. When her father opened his arms, she fell into them and whispered something he didn't repeat for days. When he finally did, it stopped the room cold. "She says it was warmer in there than she's ever felt. Said the heat don't burn like a stove, it hugs you." And after that, they came in 2s, then in 3s, not to stay, just to ask, just to see, just to hope. By the 2nd week of February, Clara had let 6 people in for short visits, never all at once, never for long, always dusk or dawn, always brief. She spoke very little, but the pattern was clear: sick children, elderly, 1 pregnant woman, and once, just once, a man carrying an infant wrapped in deer hide who never said a word except please. She let them all in, one by one, and the whispers turned into stories. They said her floor was warm to the touch, that she had a stove buried in the stone like an old Roman bath, that the smoke from her chimney didn't smell of wood at all, but of something older, that there were copper pipes hidden in the walls, or fire bricks from the east, that her husband had been a mason or an engineer or something else entirely. But the most persistent rumor was this: that somewhere in the center of the tower, buried under layers of mortar and packed earth, was a single glowing stone, something from deep in the mountain, something hewn from the earth in silence, something that didn't burn out. No one could prove it, but even the ones who scoffed at the idea stopped laughing when the winds howled, and more than one settler, grown men with ice on their eyelashes and panic in their breath, found themselves walking past her land, hoping for a glimpse, a flicker, a sign that someone like her had figured it out before it was too late for the rest of them. The last real blizzard came in March. It blew in hard and fast, a sudden white that swallowed the valley by nightfall. You couldn't see past the trees. Snow hit sideways, driven by winds that rattled stovepipes and slammed barn doors off hinges. Men prayed, children cried. Even the strongest among them admitted later they didn't think they'd survive that night. But when the wind broke, just before dawn, they heard something strange. Bells, not loud, not church bells, something smaller, lighter, like the kind a child might wear on a ribbon, coming from the top of the stone tower. And when morning came and the skies cleared, they saw it, cloth tied to the tower's peak, flapping weakly in the wind. A signal. She was still alive, and so was anyone inside. By the time the snow began to loosen its grip on the valley, Clara Worth was no longer just a woman. She was a landmark, a compass point, a fixed and silent presence in the minds of every settler, rancher, trader, and drifter that passed through the northern pass that spring. No one said it aloud, but the whole town began to move around her. Routes shifted, trails veered closer to her land. Even the old map in the schoolhouse, hand-drawn and barely legible, sprouted a new mark. A tower, etched in pencil, right where the road from the south curved near the river bend. The tower had no official name, but when people talked about it now, they simply said her place, and everyone knew who they meant. The thaw came slow, as it always did in that valley. March turned to April, and the snow turned to rot. Mud climbed past the ankles, wells filled with runoff, and and roofs gave up their last clumps of ice. The cabins that had cracked during the deep freeze now revealed mold behind the logs, warped timbers, and sagging foundations. Families pulled away paneling to find entire nests of rodents who'd huddled in their walls. But the tower had no such weaknesses. Its stones did not rot, its floors did not bend, its hearth still smoked, slow and steady, every morning like breath from the earth itself. And while others repaired, desperately, Clara prepared, because she knew what they didn't. The storm had not been the worst of it. What came next, after the freeze, was hunger. You could hear the trouble first in the mercantile. People came with coin, hoping it could fill the holes where flour used to be, hoping to trade lumber for dried beans or salt pork for potatoes that hadn't already sprouted mold. But the truth was this. The freeze had choked the stores, trapped wagons, delayed supply trains. Even the traders from the south had stopped short of the pass when word of the deep snow reached their camps. One by one, settlers began to realize the same grim fact. They were going to run out, and soon. It was the Myers boy, Todd, who came to Clara first, not for warmth, for help. He knocked just before sunrise, stood alone in the cold, his boots covered in what looked like flour dust. His coat didn't match, his gloves were frayed to the seam. When Clara opened the door, she didn't greet him, she just looked. He didn't speak at first. Then finally, "We need help." Clara said nothing. "It's my little sister," he added. She can't keep food down, and we ain't got much left. If you know a way to make it stretch or heat it right." She stepped aside. He blinked. "Just me?" "No," Clara said. "Bring the girl, and nothing else." The next time the door opened, Todd had his sister in his arms. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair thin under her cap. Her skin was flushed in that worrying way, too pink, like it was pretending not to be sick. Clara took her from his arms like she was lifting a loaf of bread. Then she shut the door. Todd stood outside for nearly an hour before she opened it again. The girl was wrapped in wool, her eyes brighter, her hands no longer shivering. Clara handed her back without a word and shut the door again. And that was how the feeding began. In the weeks that followed, Clara did what none of them expected. She cooked, not for all, not at first, but for the ones who came with children, for the women with calloused hands and eyes too dry to cry, for the ragged families that had once whispered jokes about her and now stood at the edge of her clearing, hats in hand, too ashamed to speak. She gave them food they didn't recognize, a kind of bread dense with seeds and dark flour, soups that smelled of onion and root vegetables no one had seen in months, broth that steamed with an aroma they couldn't place, part smoke, part earth, part something they would later call old warmth. No one ever saw her buy supplies. No one saw her trade. Yet the food came, and more than that, it restored. Children who'd stopped speaking began to talk again. Old men who hadn't stood upright in weeks were seen walking past the ridge with stronger steps. Even the Kinley baby, who'd nearly died in the deep freeze, began to smile again. And still, Clara never said much. She never opened her home to more than 1 or 2 at a time, never let them stay. But they came anyway, drawn not just by need, but by the strange grounding fact of her existence. Because when you'd seen her tower, when you'd stood in that little ring of earth she kept cleared of snow by hand, you felt like winter couldn't hurt you quite the same way anymore. It was Eliza Kern who finally asked what they all wondered. She came with a satchel of hand-milled flour and a bundle of herbs, wrapped tight in oilcloth. Clara accepted them, set them on a stone table just inside the door. Eliza didn't leave right away. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked softly. "Back in the fall, you knew the freeze was coming." Clara didn't answer. Eliza looked down at the floor. "They said you were mad. Even I thought it. But now I wonder if we were the ones." Still silence. Eliza nodded to herself, turned to go. But just as she stepped off the stoop, Clara spoke, her voice flat and quiet. "I knew it would be worse than last year." Eliza froze. "I didn't know how bad," Clara added. "But the birds left early, the bees sealed deep, and the mountain elk—" She paused. "They moved east before the first snow." Eliza turned back. "So you built this?" Clara looked her in the eye. "I built what I could," and closed the door. Spring came, but slow, too slow. The first melt didn't bring grass, only mud. The animals came down early, confused. A bear was seen nosing through a sod roof before it even fully thawed. The creek ran high and brown, and with it came sickness. The fever took 5 more. A baby, 2 old men, a girl of 9, and one of the drifters who'd refused to leave his camp even in the worst of the cold. They buried them late, in muddy earth. under skies that still carried frost. But Clara's tower stood unchanged. No sickness came from there, no cough, no heat flush, no death. And that's when the envy began. Quiet at first. A glance here, a whispered comment there, then sharper. She must be hoarding something. I seen her come back with a bag full of jars. She got her husband's tools buried somewhere. You watch, bet there's a storehouse under that tower. Maybe she ain't just cooking, maybe she's witching. It didn't take long before the wrong men started thinking the same thought, that maybe Clara didn't deserve to keep what she had, that maybe, just maybe, someone ought to go take it. It was a Tuesday when they came, 3 of them, not the drunkards or the town fools, but clever men, the kind who knew how to pry a lock, how to dig a tunnel, how to make it look like an accident. They waited until just after dusk, slipped through the trees, silent as ghosts. One circled around to the back toward the chimney. One went for the door. The last, the youngest, carried a satchel of tools and a coil of rope. They didn't speak, didn't knock, just began their quiet approach. And that's when it happened. The earth cracked, not loudly, not like thunder, but low, deep, like something beneath the ground shifted its weight and sighed. The youngest man stopped cold. The others didn't hear it until the stones began to glow, just faintly. Just along the base, a dim reddish shimmer, like coals under skin. They stepped back. One cursed, another dropped his tool, and then, from the top of the tower, a bell rang. Not metal, not iron, but something older, something that shook the chest more than the ear. The wind changed, the glow faded, and from inside the tower, a voice called out, "You do not want what I've built." It was Clara, calm, unafraid. The men froze, no one moved, and after a long minute they turned and walked away. By summer, the town had changed. Not because it wanted to, because it had to. The old cabins were rebuilt, not in pine, but in stone. Foundations were sunk deeper. Roofs were insulated with moss and clay, instead of just bark. New settlers who arrived were directed not to the church first, but to the tower, to see it, to learn. A kind of quiet reverence had taken root. No one said Clara's name too loudly. No one asked her for more than she offered. But when she passed through town, once every few weeks now, walking steady with a wrapped parcel in hand, or a spool of copper wire slung over her shoulder, people stepped aside. And when she left, they watched the trail long after she'd gone. Not because she was strange, but because she was proof that there was a way to survive what others couldn't. That fall, on the first night the frost returned, a dozen families lit candles in their windows, not for warmth, but for her. And far up the ridge, in the tower, no one dared mock anymore. Clara lit her own, not to signal, not to warn, but to remind them. Winter remembers who prepared. Autumn passed like a held breath. After the last frost warning, the valley grew oddly quiet again. Not the hush of fear this time, but of learning. For the first time since the railroad was cut off 2 winters ago, the settlers weren't just surviving, they were copying. Men once too proud to take advice were now chiseling stone with borrowed tools. Women who'd once called Clara unstable now stood at the edge of her clearing, studying how her drainage channels pulled meltwater away from the stone base. Some even scribbled sketches into spare ledgers, what little paper they had left, copying the arched vents she'd made above the 2nd floor, or the way her roof pitched, not with shingles, but a clay-mud composite hardened against rain. No one asked to come in anymore. They had learned better, but they watched, and she let them. The pastor began preaching different sermons that season, not of sin, or wrath, or suffering, not like last winter when every freeze felt like punishment, and every death like a test of the town's will. No, these new sermons were more humble. He spoke of preparation, of understanding the signs of nature. He began quoting old texts, not just the Bible, but foreign wisdom from far-off places. China, Norway, the Andes, tales of people who had built not with what they wanted, but what they had. God gave you your land, but he also gave you stone, he said one Sunday, and it was the widow who noticed first. Nobody disagreed. They still didn't speak her name much. That was part of the new reverence, like speaking it too loudly might lessen what she'd done, or turn it into something explainable. It wasn't superstition, not anymore. It was respect. They called it the Tower Way. When someone reinforced a hearth with stone underlayment, they were doing it the Tower Way. When a man sunk a second doorway 4 feet into the ground so heat wouldn't escape, the Tower Way. When the new schoolhouse plans were drafted, and the teacher insisted the rear room be dug into the earth like a cellar, that was the Tower Way too. They never gave her credit directly. She didn't want it, but she saw, and she kept building, because Clara wasn't finished. The tower, it turned out, was just the beginning. Come October, the settlers noticed something odd near the base of the ridge, a low wall going up, rough stones, arranged in a winding half-circle like a ribcage buried in the dirt. No one could tell what it was. It wasn't a house, no roof, too low for shelter, too wide to be a fence. By November, it stretched nearly 40 feet in either direction. A curved wall, 3 feet high, wrapping in on itself like a spiral. When the first snow came again, Clara placed stones into the gaps, like a puzzle, sealing sections shut with packed moss and old mortar. Some whispered she was building a corral, others thought it was a garden bed, but a few of the older settlers saw the truth. She was building a wind ring, a passive heat trap, something rarely seen outside of Europe or the steppes, shaped to catch the low winter sun and radiate it inward, a place to hold warmth without fire. She's making a fireless stove the size of a house, someone muttered. They were only half right. That winter, the storms came late but heavy, not the same creeping death of the year before. This was the old kind, snow that stacked fast and slid in waves off the eaves, wind that bent fence posts sideways and filled footprints in seconds. But this time, they were ready. They had copied her tower designs, reinforced their walls, dug deep drainage. Some even mimicked her buried floor beds, though few managed it well. And still, despite all their effort, the tower stayed warmer. One man swore he saw Clara step out one dawn with steam rising from her sleeves like a bakery vent. No scarf, just wool and calm. Another said she boiled water in her hand with no stove at all, that it hissed against her palm, and she didn't flinch. The myths began again, but now they protected her. That January, disaster returned. Not cold this time. Fire. A child kicked over an oil lamp in the north barn, where 3 families were sleeping during house repairs. Flames leapt fast, dry straw erupting, horses bucking. Snow melted instantly around the base of the blaze, sending steam hissing skyward. No one died, but everything they had went up with it. Blankets, clothing, tools, even the barrel stove they'd carried from Missouri. And that was how they ended up at Clara's tower. 6 of them, 3 women, 2 children, and a boy too old to be a child but too young to be a man. They didn't knock. They just stood at the edge of her clearing. Clara saw them from her window. And this time she came out. She didn't ask what happened. She knew. The third winter came, and it came like a warning fulfilled. The kind of winter that doesn't begin with a blizzard or a storm or even a wind, but with a stillness, a dead calm that settled over the land like a blanket too heavy to lift. The sun dimmed before it should have. The air lost its voice. Birds vanished. You could smell it coming, that cold copper scent like old blood in snow. Men muttered about it around fires. Women hushed their children without knowing why. And Clara built. She did not rush. She did not shout. She did not recruit help. She moved alone across the stone terraces behind the tower, now laid out like a hand open to the sky, setting the final stones of a second spiral ring that no one dared step inside. The pattern was strange, winding and uneven. Not a shelter this time, not a place to store heat, something else. One man tried to map it, a drifter from the railroad camps, half drunk and full of pride. He sketched it from a nearby hill, squinting through the haze, trying to chart the design. He never finished. Something in the middle made him stop. He left in the night, didn't speak a word. By morning, the map was burned to ash. That winter broke the timberline. Pine trees cracked in the hills. Elk stumbled into town starving. Coyotes came down to the fields in broad daylight. The cold moved sideways through the cabins, slipping between every plank and log like it knew the weaknesses by name. Stoves burned out in hours. Wood piles vanished, chimneys choked, and then, one by one, the families came. They didn't knock, not this time. They knew better. They stood in the field below the tower, dozens of them, not begging, not asking, just waiting. No fire, no smoke, just silence. And Clara stepped out of her tower. She looked at them, all of them, the ones who had mocked, the ones who had watched, the ones who had whispered and wandered and waited too long. And then she walked, not away from them, but to the center of the ring. She stood there, in that strange spiral of stone that no one understood. She knelt, pressed her hand flat to the center, and the ground began to breathe. It was not fire, not heat like fire gives. It was deep warmth, rising like a tide, radiating outward through the stone in slow waves. A hush spread over the crowd as they watched the frost recede from the center. Steam rose from the cracks. Not smoke, steam, as if the earth had drawn breath again and decided this once to share it. She beckoned. They came, children first, then the mothers, then the men. The warmth wasn't just comfort, it was clarity. It eased the ache behind the eyes, softened joints stiff with hunger, quieted the noise in the skull that cold brings when it starts to win. They stayed for hours, no words, only breath, only life. Later, when the temperature dropped again, Clara gestured for them to go. Some lingered. She nodded toward the trail. They obeyed, not because they feared her, but because they believed her. She had made warmth in a winter that didn't allow it, and they would not betray that trust. That season she took no more visitors. The tower stayed closed. The ring remained quiet, but every day, at the same hour, smoke curled once again from the tower's single flue. Not thick, not black, but pale, steady, measured, as if reminding the town she was alive, and she still had more to do. The pastor came once more in early spring. He did not bring sermons this time, only a jar of honey, from the first hive that had survived the winter in 3 years. He left it at the base of her door, said a prayer under his breath, and walked back down the trail. Then came the thaw, real this time. Grass poked through the hill cracks. The ice broke loose from the creek. Horses kicked at the melting snow. Babies were born again in warm barns. Seeds went into soil with fingers no longer cracked from frost. And Clara, she did not leave her tower, not until the equinox. On that morning, pale blue sky, thin clouds drifting high, she stepped out with a spade and a sack of ash. She walked past the old spiral, past the fire ring, past the clearing, to the edge of the bluff where her husband and child were buried beneath 2 flat stones and a ring of river rock. She knelt and she planted one seed from a stalk she'd saved, from a strain long lost to most, and she watered it with melted snow she'd stored in a sealed clay pot since the first freeze. No one saw her do it, but later they'd find the stalk rising faster than the others, and no one ever cut it down. The settlers changed. They no longer mocked what they didn't understand. They studied. They asked quieter questions. They built smaller, dug deeper, reinforced with stone. They passed the lessons down to sons, to daughters. They told the story of the woman who built not with hope, not with pride, but with grief sharpened into knowledge. They said she was stubborn, hard, unbending, but never unkind. Years later, long after the storms stopped coming so hard, long after the valley had softened again with trade and rail and town proper, the children still walked past the tower and touched its stones like pilgrims to an altar. They called her the Warm Widow, a name she never heard. She passed in her sleep one spring night, with the fire burning low. No one found her for 2 days, but her bed was still warm when they did. The tower had held its heat, even after her breath was gone. They did not bury her in the ground. They did not lay her in the town plot. They set her body in the stone ring she had built, sealed it with earth packed and blessed, and planted 12 fruit trees around the perimeter, one for each settler who had stood in her field that bitter winter morning and waited for her to bring them in. The trees still stand. The fruit grows red and full, even in late season, even after early frost, especially then. And when newcomers ask about the tower, that strange windowless column with no door now, no smoke, no light, the town only says, she built what we couldn't. And then they lead them down the trail, past the second spiral, to the 12 trees, and they offer them fruit, still warm to the touch, even after dark, even after all this time.